Hi everyone, I'm Maki Moussavi. I'm a transformational coach, and I specialize in helping people who are high achievers and type A personalities help optimize your mindset and find a definition of success that works for you, not just checking the boxes of what you've been taught really matters to society. And so today I'm going to be talking about toxic relationships and setting boundaries. And I often get this question about why I talk about this when my specialty is trying to help people find success and find fulfillment. And the answer is that toxic relationships are an incredibly damaging thing to have in your life when you are on a personal development journey of any kind. They will keep you stuck, they will keep you from reaching your full potential, and they will keep you from really being in your full power. It's incredibly important to clean up the energy in your personal and work relationships to make sure that you are empowered to move forward and create for your life what you really want. So today we're going to focus on this very specific slice of relationships, how to identify them as toxic, what to do about it, and how to go from there. So a really good first place to start is, how do you know if a relationship is toxic? There are so many examples of toxic behavior in our society right now that it's very possible that you're seeing examples and can immediately call to mind and recognize this is a behavior that is not okay. It's not good. It's not acceptable. But there are so many other behaviors that are more subtle and that are just as bad and damaging and toxic that we don't tend to recognize the same way that we recognize the ones that are more overt. We're going to talk about how to discern between those two types. And the reason that I like to talk about this and to point it out the way that I will is because I have a lot of personal experience, unfortunately, with toxic behavior. It's something that I grew up with. And I know from firsthand experience what it's like and how it can affect your entire life in very negative and damaging ways. We're going to delve into those behaviors in a way that kind of layers so that you can start to examine and think about. So as we're talking about this, please think about some of the people in your life and the little aha moments that you might be having about a person that this may describe in your life, so that you can even hold that example in your mind and see if the things that we're talking about resonate, in order to help your recognition and in order to help you move forward with a plan. So let's start with this acronym, FOG. This actually came from a book called Emotional Blackmail, which I highly recommend. Very, very good book for anyone who has struggled with toxic relationships in the past. Gets into a lot of details. We're not going to get into a lot of detail today, but I do want you to remember this because it's an acronym and it's a really, really good kind of cheat sheet way of recognizing toxic behavior. The F stands for fear. Fear is a behavior or an emotion that somebody who is trying to get you to do something they want you to do, they'll use that in order to manipulate you into doing what it is that they're asking you to do. So here's an example. If you're in a relationship that has overtly kind of abusive tones, an obvious way to think of this would be a direct threat to your safety. So somebody may say to you, if you do X or Y, like if you go out to dinner with your friend, then I am going to do X as a retaliation, right? So that kind of instills fear in you, and you may not want to, and you may feel threatened by that, so you will avoid that behavior. So that kind of is one of our overt or obvious examples of fear and the role that it plays. A more subtle example is one where the fear is instilled or created on behalf of the person who is trying to get you to do what they want you to do. So here's a personal example for me. When I was growing up, my mom used to use this technique a lot to get me to not do the things that she didn't want me to do. So if I would say to her, I'm going to go on a short road trip to a nearby town as a teenager because we're going to go shopping, she would say to me something like, I'm just really afraid you're going to get into a car accident and something terrible is going to happen to you. Will it have been worth it to take that risk? So she was kind of putting her own fear into the situation in order to get me to do what she wanted me to do. So that's a little more subtle, but it's still fear in both cases. Now let's move on to the O. The O is for obligation. This is when someone uses your sense of obligation to them to get you to do the things they want you to do. Maybe it's someone who asks a lot of favors. And these can be favors that if you take them kind of one at a time with various friends and acquaintances, they're not a big deal. It could be something like, hey, could you take me to the airport? Or would you mind feeding my dog for me while I'm gone? Those aren't really a big deal, right? But when you're in a toxic relationship, what happens is that becomes a more constant kind of drain on your time, and it can start to feel like you're being taken advantage of by somebody who is consistently expecting you to put yourself out and to inconvenience yourself in order to do what they need you to do. So anyone who uses the sense of like an obligation, that you have an obligation to them to do this thing, that is a really big red flag as well. I once worked with a woman who said she had a friend who would always just call her, I'm super busy at work, can you just please go feed my dog? And she knew the reason that she would call her was because her kids had left home. She was just chilling out, relaxing, having a glass of wine. And so this friend just kind of would present it as, you don't have anything better to do and it would really help me, so could you please go do this? And just kind of playing on that sense of obligation. So watch for the fear again, and then obligation. And then the G stands for guilt. And guilt can be very closely tied to obligation. This is where we all know what it feels like to be put on a guilt trip by somebody who says, oh, it's been so long, don't you want to see me? Don't you miss me? I miss you. Or you call them and they make a big deal about how long it's been since you've been in touch. So this sense of like making you feel kind of icky for not just being there for them or doing for them the things that they expect you to do. All of these things are very commonly used behaviors, and there's lots of different ways that they'll show up. The main thing to understand, though, is that they are all forms of manipulation. It's incredibly important to acknowledge and recognize that toxic behavior has the intent of manipulating you into doing what the other person wants. This is why it's so damaging to have these toxic relationships in your life. And if you're starting to feel uncomfortable because you have some people in mind where maybe this is what's happening with them, understand it's okay to feel uncomfortable about it, but it's also important to acknowledge the reality of the matter, which is that these are people who use emotion to manipulate you into doing what they're asking you to do. As you can probably tell from where we started with the fog symptoms and signs, toxic people are people who do not have boundaries. They tend to see other people as extensions of themselves and whatever it is they need. So they come to you and say, I need you to do this, or I'm asking for your time, or I need you to listen to me. There is no boundary for them where you're concerned. You're there to meet their needs. And they often inject a sense of urgency into that need so that it becomes very difficult to ignore them. If they call and you don't answer, they may call again. And they believe they're entitled to whatever it is that they're asking you for. So it's this lack of boundaries that's really at the heart of this interaction that we're going to be addressing in terms of how to get past that and make that piece better. Now, you've heard this before. This is out there a lot right now, but we're going to reiterate it. As we talk about this energy of manipulation, very important to acknowledge and realize that toxic people are energy vampires. They want your energy. And they are not going to go away because you're giving them what they want. This is actually one of the most challenging things about being a person who is not toxic in relationship with a person who is toxic. The people who are in those interactions often think it's just easier to give in to what this person is asking me for so that I don't have to rock the boat, so that we can just kind of get past this. You want to placate them. You don't want maybe the overreactions or drama that's going to come from saying no. But that's exactly the kind of thing that opens that pattern and that dynamic up for you to continue in that sense of having to continue to feed what they're asking for. And I think a really important way to judge sometimes, and we're talking about specific signs and symptoms, but one important thing that you can do is actually to trust your gut around who in your life may be acting as a vampire as far as your energy is concerned. A really good way to do that is to think of what it feels like when that person calls you on the phone and you see the caller ID. What does that feel like to you? Do you feel dread having to talk to them? Would you rather not answer the phone? Do you kind of groan knowing what you're in for? If you know you have a meeting with a particular person who is going to be problematic, do you kind of tense up ahead of time? Your own kind of physical and emotional reaction to someone can be the most critical piece of identifying a relationship as toxic, even if you haven't taken the time to intellectually go through the list of all the signs and symptoms. So it's really important for you to acknowledge how you feel and what you're seeing, because that is the thing that is going to tip you off to the fact that things are really not okay. We also tend to get a lot into justification when it comes to these types of folks, where it's difficult for us to articulate to someone else exactly why they make us feel the way we do. So we start to question and wonder if something is wrong with us instead. And I don't want you to do that. If you've got this feeling, hey, I know when that phone rings, or if I have to go and be with this person, I get triggered by this dread and this anxiety, those are really good red flags to be paying attention to. Okay, so another thing to be aware of as far as signs and symptoms are concerned is something that's called gaslighting. And again, we're in this period of time in our society where I think people are talking about this a lot more, and I think that's really healthy that we're actually talking about these behaviors instead of acting like they don't exist. This is an interesting term. It actually came from a movie called Gaslight, an old black and white movie where a man was turning down the gas lamps in his home and making it really dark, and it was hard for his wife to see. And she kept commenting on, it's so dark in here, I can't see. And he would tell her that he didn't know what she was talking about, even though he was the one who had created those conditions in the first place. So that's where the term comes from. And what it is a form of psychological manipulation that actually makes you doubt yourself. It can happen with an individual and it can happen with a group, but the intention here is to make you question yourself, or to make this group question what they heard, their own perception, and it can make you feel kind of crazy. This is an incredibly powerful way of manipulating someone, and it's typically done in one of two ways. It's through denial or through lying. If someone has said something to you in an interaction that hurts your feelings or that bothers you, and then you go and try to have a conversation about that, and that person says, I never said that, or you said this first, or basically tries to twist either the meaning or even the fact that they said it at all in that conversation, that's gaslighting. And we all know what it feels like to be on the other end of that. We really do start to question, well, am I remembering it wrong? Did it really happen that way? But over time, as that person employs that technique over and over again, we absolutely catch on and know that it's happening. This is a really common technique, and one incredibly challenging thing that I think people try to do here is, again, they try to use logic and reason with someone who's using emotional techniques to confuse and to manipulate. So you really can't use logic and reason, and that's how you get trapped in these conversations, because you're using two different kinds of forms of communication, and they're not actually on the same level at that point. So gaslighting is an important one to keep in mind. Other common behaviors that are definitely worth mentioning because they are so almost cookie cutter. I think this is one of the things that's really fascinating about toxic behaviors is that once you start to recognize them in certain people and you start to become better at perceiving who is toxic, it's almost like there's a recipe for toxic behavior, and all the people who display it kind of follow the same mold. So these are some of the common ones I wanted to call out for you. The first is what we call non-apologies. This is where a person does not apologize for something that they get called out for. This could be a situation where, again, back to that conversation example, you let somebody know, hey, what you said really hurt my feelings, and they start by saying, I'm sorry if you feel that way. So that redirects basically the responsibility for the way you feel back to you. Or I'm sorry, but, and then excuses are made. Those are not real apologies. And it's really important to recognize when someone is sincere. Even if you can sometimes feel that it's not sincere, there actually are verbal clues that tell you also that they're not sincere. So watch for the non-apology. The second is very closely related, and that's a refusal to accept responsibility. This is incredibly common. there's just a lot of blame shifting. I did this because you did that, or I'm like this because someone did this to me, or I'm sorry, I'm just having a really rough day, right? There's always a reason, there's always something else to point at versus saying, my bad, I'm really sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry that I did. I'm going to watch that next time. It's on me. It's my fault. You will not hear words like that from people who are toxic. Okay. So those first two go together pretty tightly, as does the next, which is a victim mindset. The reason, though, that it's important to recognize this one is that we can see this in a lot of people who are more subtly toxic. So a lot of people who are really nice, but who are just victims in the world. I'm so unhappy. My job is so hard. This person is mean to me. Never really feeling empowered to step up and say, if I don't like it, I'm going to change it. Or I'm the one who's in control of my destiny. It's on me to do X or Y. It's always about how they're being wronged and how the people around them don't understand. So those first few really they flow together, but they're also distinct. So be on the lookout for some of those commonalities, but also understand that they're not wholly distinct. The next kind of goes without saying. I think, lack of empathy and compassion, very common hallmarks of toxic behavior. Just this inability to put yourself in the other person's position, to understand what it feels like to be where they are, to really not have an understanding at all of why a situation that person in is hard for them. In fact, they may even look at that person and go, well, they should have done something differently, or they really shouldn't be in that position. They should just get over it, or they should just do something else to make it better. Just not really feeling the compassion for the other person in whatever situation they're in. And then the last, passive aggression, is another can be a very subtle behavior. So people who are less overtly toxic will employ passive aggression. One of my favorite examples of this is someone that I used to work with who, it took me a while to catch on to why it bothered me so much, but we would sit in meetings, and this was a person who just would never make a comment and wouldn't really have verbal reactions to what was happening. But there was a lot of physical reactions, like making faces or folding, arms over the chest or pushing back from the table. It was a lot of nonverbal communication without ever articulating what they were objecting to or reacting to. And it got to the point where it was so distracting because I almost couldn't listen to what was happening. I was just waiting to see what they were reacting to and being confused about why they were reacting that way. And that can be a really common toxic behavior in people who aren't necessarily super outspoken, but that still want to create that kind of discomfort around the dynamics. And it's also related to the type of person who may be really nice to your face and have nice things to say, but you may hear through the grapevine they said something behind your back, or that like to undermine people behind their backs. Be on the lookout for things like that as well. I'm going to mention personality disorders, but this is definitely not intended to be diagnostic. It's worth mentioning because in some very toxic people who you feel like we're just checking all the boxes as we're talking about these different behaviors, those behaviors are also attributed to personality disorders, what are called the cluster B personality disorders. And there's a lot of really good, reputable websites out there where you can do research, like I referenced here, the Mayo Clinic. Make sure that you're looking for those resources that are attached to names in medicine that you can trust if you want to do some additional reading. Again, not intended to be diagnostic, but if you are dealing with a particularly challenging person, go read up on these and see if any of these kind of resonates with you. And if you feel like you're in a situation where you are dealing with someone who is actually personality disordered, please get professional help. It's a very challenging thing to try to deal with anyone that has a personality disorder. They are typically people who don't recognize that there's a problem on their side, but you may need support from someone who does understand the real issues, and seek the professional help if you need it, okay? We're going to shift gears for just a minute. We've been talking a lot about the person who's toxic and is just displaying the behaviors that you need to be on the lookout for. But now we're going to talk about you as a person who's in relationship with someone who's toxic. I hope now, even if you had the recognition before, maybe as we're talking, you're getting the recognition now, that you understand if there are relationships like this in your life, that it has to stop. These are dynamics that are basically creating these patterns in your life where you're getting very used to subverting your needs to the needs of another person. And you don't feel empowered to say what you really think, to take a stand for yourself, and to express how you really feel. You're basically eating a bunch of your feelings in order to make sure that this other person is okay when you're not okay. Okay, so this is why this has to stop. And we're going to talk about what role you're playing in a context that makes it clear how that interaction is damaging to you as well as the other person. So there's two definitions we're going to cover here. The first is an enabler is a person that makes something possible. When we are in these toxic dynamics, we can feel very frustrated. It can feel very isolating. We don't really know what to do. Maybe we've tried some things and it hasn't worked. But your dynamic with that person is making it possible for this dynamic to continue. This is not a one-sided thing. So if there's any piece of you that's been tempted to say, I wish this person would change, I wish this person would be better, it's time to move on to how can you change the way that you're interacting with this person in order to change the entire situation and or stop being in relationship with this person altogether. This is a pattern that must be broken. So you are making it possible for this other person to do what they're doing. That's the first definition to keep in mind. The second is an enabler is a person who encourages or enables self-destructive behavior in another person. So this other person is going through life, isolating themselves, burning bridges, creating problems. And if you are someone who is allowing their behavior to continue, you may actually be contributing to their destruction, their self-destruction. And it's not your responsibility to make sure that that person doesn't self-destruct, but you don't want to be participating in it either, right? So an enabler, being someone who's allowing this to continue, has these deeper meanings that I just want you to kind of keep front and center as we start to talk about how to set boundaries. Now, before we start with the boundary conversation, I do want to acknowledge that it can be very difficult to establish boundaries in your relationships. We might be talking about people who are really close to you. Maybe it's a spouse, parent, sibling, even a child who is displaying these behaviors, and you're thinking, it's not possible to set a boundary, or it feels selfish to set a boundary. How do I do that if I love this person? Doesn't that make me selfish? Boundaries are a way for you to take care of yourself, not to shut someone else out. They really are guardrails for your mental and emotional health. They're necessary. As we're talking, it should be becoming more and more clear to you that this person is just going to keep taking from you, and you participating hurts that person as well. Setting a boundary is a way of first taking care of yourself, which is the most important thing, and secondarily, basically withdrawing any kind of enabling behavior from the other person, so that if they do have the opportunity and the desire to learn and change, that you're contributing to that instead of keeping them where they are. So let's talk about how to establish boundaries. The first thing is you must be very, very clear with yourself and the other person. This is like disciplining a child, to really break it down. If you consistently threaten your child with a consequence that you don't enforce, they're not going to believe you, right? If you tell them, if you pick up that toy one more time, I'm going to send you to your room for the rest of the night, and then they pick up the toy again and you don't send them to their room, you're basically teaching them that you don't mean what you say. And with a toxic person, it's critical that you pick a boundary that you can enforce. So you might have to baby step this. You might have to pick a really small boundary. Maybe if it's someone who's consistently calling you and asking for things, you let them know, or you just start by establishing the boundary next time they call. Hey, I'm not going to be doing stuff like that for you anymore. And you stick with that. So the next time they try to call and try to get you to do that thing, you're still saying no. It's important to be clear and to follow through with what you pick. So pick something that you can stick to. Learn to say no. No is a complete sentence. You do not need to justify why you're saying no. This is a trap, okay? The other person is going to ask you why you're saying no. And that's so they can poke holes and use those toxic manipulative behaviors to get you to change your mind, to feel guilty, to feel obligated. Just say no and resist the urge to tell that person why you're saying no. Just say, that just doesn't work for me, and let it go. But do experiment with doing that, especially with things that are maybe smaller at first, and then you can build up from there. We kind of talked about this before, but I'm going to reiterate this now. Do not rely on reason and logic. You cannot use reason and logic to overcome an emotional tactic. It will not work. The only thing that does have a chance of working is setting a boundary that you enforce. And this is strictly here's the action that if you take equals this consequence. That other person, if they're invested and they care and they're able to take feedback, it may take repetition. This is actually your best chance of reaching them. So resist the urge to write a dissertation about why you're doing what you're doing, and just tell them, if you do X, I'm going to do Y. And that's it, and then stick with it. If you're ever not sure what you should do in a particular situation, like let's say someone is asking you for something or behaving in a way that you aren't sure if it really kind of is violating a boundary or if it's something that you're comfortable with, check in with your own needs. How do you feel in that moment? Do you feel like uncomfortable? Do you feel uneasy? Do you feel like there's something about it that's just not right? If you're ever in doubt, put your own needs first and really check in with your own feelings and your gut on that one, and then go, okay, I need to take care of myself first, so here's what I'm going to say in response to that. This last bullet is really for you. Protect yourself by letting go of any expectations that you may have of this person. It's so tempting to think that you can change them, that you can teach them through modeling, that something they're doing is wrong, or just by reasoning with them. And you may try over and over and over again and repeatedly feel disappointed when that behavior repeats itself. Stop having expectations that anything that you are going to do is going to change this person's behavior. Allow yourself to be pleasantly surprised if they end up making the changes rather than expecting it and setting yourself up for disappointment. That last one's really for you. So if you've got somebody in mind and you think, yeah, I've been disappointed over and over again, start working on dropping expectations and setting boundaries that you can enforce. And then lastly, on this piece, give yourself the space to grieve. If this is an important relationship and you're coming to this recognition that it's unhealthy, that there are things that need to change, that you need to distance yourself, or even maybe that it's not okay to still be engaged in relationship with this person, it can be very, very sad. These are relationships that maybe you've had for a long time. So let yourself be sad about it. Give yourself the space to grieve. It's okay to be sad and to feel the loss of whatever that dynamic in that relationship is, but know that you're doing it for reasons that are actually going to be more supportive to you in the long term, and that it's just a part of the process to go through that piece of it. The last thing I want to talk about is guilt and shame. One of the things that is the saddest to me about those of us who've experienced toxic relationships is how guilty and ashamed we feel as the person who's on the other end of that relationship for maybe some of the thoughts and feelings we've had over time about this person. If you have ever felt like, I wish this person would move away, I wish this person would disappear, maybe you've even had thoughts like, I wish this person would die because my life would be easier. It can trigger lots of shame and guilt to feel that way about someone that you're close to. It makes you question what kind of person you are. It makes you wonder what's wrong with you. And I want to tell you very clearly that there is nothing wrong with you. It's a testament to just how challenging those relationship dynamics have been and how much of your energy it has drained emotionally that you feel that way to begin with. So don't judge yourself. It's okay that, you may feel like life would be easier if this person wasn't around. That's kind of the dynamic that has been set up. So I just want to let you know there's nothing wrong with you, and it's definitely time to move forward and do something about these dynamics that are making you feel that way so that you can move forward, really clean up the energy of your life, and feel empowered beyond just these relationships to go after what you want by using your voice and setting limits on what you'll accept from other people. So if you'd like to contact me, here's my email address and also my website. And I also want to let you know that I've written a book. You can actually find it on my website as well as Amazon, called The High Achiever's Guide. And I actually dedicated the entire second chapter of this book to the topics we were just talking about around toxic relationships. So if that's something that would be helpful for you to have beyond just listening to this talk, that is a resource as well. And lastly, I'll just say, we're living in very strange times, and it's strange to be doing this talk without being in front of you all. So I really would love to hear from you after you've listened to this, if anything here resonated with you, or if you felt like it gives you permission in some way to move forward and you feel more empowered by it. So thank you so much.